Okay, welcome everybody. Today, there will be two parts to this lecture, or three parts actually. First, we'll spend a fair amount of time to review the exam, like what the exam is going to be like, since a major component of it is going to be like critiquing and visualization, I'll give you like a little bit more hands-on guidelines based on the theoretical lectures we had to like how can you critique a visualizations? What are kind of like the things that you should think about in a structured way? Then we'll wrap up the interaction lecture. There's only a couple of slides left there. And then we'll move on to multiple views. Okay, so let me get started with the exam review. Okay, so the format of the exam will be very similar to what you get in the design critique, although a little bit more structured and a little bit more comprehensive. So you will get a Google Doc with instructions, and then you can use this Google Doc to download a Word document or to copy it and edit it directly in Google Doc, and then you write your exam in there. I'll talk about later what kinds of questions will be asked, but this is going to be like you'll have 24 hours to complete that. So I'll post it at like the beginning of class time, and then I'll be around like for half an hour or so to kind of like answer any questions that people have, and I'll also be available on Slack if you have any like clarifying questions about the exam. You should then write concise and relevant answers to the questions. But the point here is concise. Since you have like a lot of time, we don't want like super long essays, right? And so there will be a word limit that you can simply check so that you like it's going to be generous enough, but we also don't want to have to read like pages and pages if you can say something concisely. And then there will be like a redesign component to the in the problem, and here you should be either sketching by hand or sketching on a tablet or using a graphic design editor. Like you should kind of think about what you prefer. So if you want to sketch by hand, you need a way to digitize your sketch, so you need to prepare for that. If you like want to work on a tablet, maybe try out like a sketching app or something like that. Or if you want, like if you're good in Illustrator, you can do that, but generally I don't recommend doing Illustrator or something like that. There will be like the majority, like 80% of your grade will be one single design critique. This is for grad students, for everybody, for undergrad students, of everybody in the 5,000 version of this class. This will be the only question. So this will be like long questions with many sub questions where you critique a visualization and apply. Like it's going to be an interactive web-based visualization, so it's not a printout. And you kind of like analyze it based on all of the stuff that we've learned in class. So I kind of like want you to think about like what are the perceptual issues, what is going on with interaction, what is going on with design guidelines, are the scales properly used, and so on. We'll talk about this in more detail later. So you need to analyze this in the context of the theory taught, and it also shows us like that you understand what's going on in the visualization. And then for grad students, there will be like a second question, which is going to be like roughly 20% of your grade. Like these are ballpark numbers, but we'll figure it out. So this is going to be something about one of these readings. So crowdsourcing interactions mostly. Okay, any questions so far? I can see there's chat. If you don't have colored pencils, you have like a week, maybe like if you want to use color, which like might be useful, maybe just get a set, like buy it on Amazon. There's still a lot of time. It's like a $2 investment or $5 investment. You can try to use shape or line style instead, but that might make your like design more challenging and less easy to communicate. Okay, so how do you critique a visualization? We've done this a lot, but I'll just like go through this a little bit more formally. So the first thing is that like you should like when you read a visualization, just like first explore it, read the text, understand the context. So yeah, so I have two questions. Yes, it will be 24 hours start time and exactly to the start time, like to the equivalent start time of the next day. When you do redesigns, it is more important to us that you kind of like convey your concepts, and we care more about like that your design is well thought through rather than like the quality of your drawing, right? Like if you're not drawing like a straight line, that's not going to be a problem, right? But make sure that you have time, right? So just make sure that you think about it carefully and put a little bit of effort into it, but it doesn't need to be like, we're not gonna like an artist that is that knows how to draw is not going to necessarily get a better grade just because their drawing looks better than somebody else who thinks about this systematically and makes well-justified design decisions. Okay, so going back to how we critique a visualization. So first we try to first read the whole thing, right? Play around with it, see what the context is, and then try to identify the data, the task, and the intentions of the designer. Very often, the kinds of visualizations that we give you, they are usually have some annotation, some context. So make sure you read all of that, and that will kind of help you to understand the tasks and the intentions. So and the data. So for example, you should look at a visualization and think about in our data lecture, is it what type of data is it? Is it network data? Is it geospatial data? Is it tabular data? Is it time series data? Is it are there sets? Are there clusters? These kinds of things. And more often or frequently, there will be multiple data types, right? So you could say, hey, yeah, I have tabular data, but it's also displayed on the map. And then I have tabular data, which is also geospatial, right? So you kind of want to this is absolutely normal that you have different types of data at the same time. And then drill a little bit more down more. Is the data quantitative or is it qualitative? Usually, you frequently have both, right? You often have qualitative labels. You might have, for example, whatever, students could be grad students or undergraduate students. We would still have everybody in one table, but we would have a qualitative label on top of it. For quantitative data, think about, is it an interval data set? Is it a ratio data set? Does it have a neutral point in the middle? Is it a time series? And then you can also try to infer tasks. Do you want to visualize changes over time, or do you want to visualize comparisons, or what are the kinds of ideas that this visualization enables? And also think about not only what the visualization enables, but what the data enables. And what kinds of questions you could ask, because that's kind of important for your redesign, right? If you see a data set in a visualization and see, hey, I could just the visualization doesn't do that, but it would be very interesting. That could be an interesting aspect of your redesign. So here, for example, this how do you feel about science piece that we had in one of the lectures when we talked about pie charts and alternatives to pie charts. So here we have kind of this, what data is that?
Do you mean categorical?
There is categorical data in there, but what's the basic structure here probably? On a high level. Is it a network?
It's tabular data.
Exactly. So it's tabular data. So we have tabular data here. And then what is kind of like the data that you have are bored, not great, okay, kind of interested, excited. What kind of like data type is that? Is it like a nominal, or is it ratio, or is it interval, or is it ordinal?
Ratio.
I would argue that is ordinal, right? Yeah. I see some people answering because it's kind of like a ranked list, but it doesn't mean that not great is 2 times as big as bored. And so then we kind of derive the counts from that, and you could make a point that this is kind of like ratio data, yeah, if you think about it this way. What task do you think, like what does the visualization designer here want you to do with this?
I guess they could want us to like take away the fact that after the intervention, a lot more people went from the okay to and were a lot more interested.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the insight they want us to learn. But more fundamentally, what they want us to do here is to compare, right? They want us to compare before and after. So that would be kind of like, if we look at the data types and the intentions of this chart, that would be roughly how you could break apart. Okay, the second part, and that is very important, is that you identify marks and channels. Remember, marks, they encode the existence of an item. So for example, in the previous piece here, it was like the square that represented this, the group of people that answers not interesting. And so that would be something like a point, a line, a shape. And then we have channels on top of them that encode the magnitude of the dimension associated with an item, or it's kind of like association with a group. That would be things like position, size, saturation, color, right? So this is like the visualization alphabet lecture, basically. And so notice that the kinds of visualization that we'll be giving to you will have multiple, like smaller visualizations. So it's going to be a multiple view visualization. And so you want to break that up. You want to say, in this part of the visualization, this here is the mark, and this is the channel. And this part, in the second part of the visualization, this is the mark, and this is the channel. And the third part, this is the mark, and this is the channel, and so on. So here we have like a chart. What are the marks here?
Points.
Exactly. We have the points, which are the marks. And what are the channels here?
Color.
Color? What do you mean? So color doesn't really encode a ton of data here. You could say that the only color we have is this additional information with this kind of confidence interval or whatever that exactly is. But what is the main channel here?
Position.
Position.
Yeah, exactly. It's position. But we do have 2 types of positions here. So we have the position on the x-axis and the position on the y-axis. And the position on the y-axis is kind of like on this ratio scale, what's called bias here. And the position on the x-axis is kind of like a categorical division. So we are like, here we are using like a position to encode a categorical label, like border and shading, border, shading, interval only. So we're using position in both ways. And then if we want to be very precise, we can say, hey, well, there's these additional marks that encode some statistically derived data. So here you could argue, hey, this is like the raw data is really the points. But then we have another data set that is derived based on that data that has these statistical values that are shown as these red marks here. The 0 line here is not data, right? This is just a reference point. So what is in this example, what is the mark here?
Area.
Yeah, it's an area or a shape. And what's the channel?
Color.
Arc length.
Arc length, I heard, and I didn't understand the first comment.
Color.
Colors. Yeah, so colors, we have colors, we have arc length, we also have size, right? So like arc length and size in this case are correlated. So like if you see a pie chart, you probably want to say, hey, like each of the segments is different in size, but it's also different in angle or arc length. And the colors here, what are the colors encoding?
Just different groups.
Do they?
But the colors repeat.
Yeah, I think the colors are just like a way here to distinguish individual marks. So I would actually argue that the colors here are purely decorative and don't actually encode any data. So you could just like do this if you have black and white, you could do that just as well, right? You could make gray segments, and if you have like proper like white borders around them, then it would easily work. So I don't think that the colors here mean anything. If you had like a supplementary legend that said, hey, all the tech industry is in shades of red, and all of the kind of like hospitality industry is in shades of green, then we would of course have like an additional variable that is encoded on top here. That would be more useful.
Sorry, so do you mean channel color is not a channel here?
Yeah, channel like color is not used to encode data here, right? It is just decorative. So like, does it make sense? Like there's no, like blue doesn't mean anything here, right? It's just like an additional distinguishing aspect for the marks. Okay, so what are the marks here?
The prisms, I guess. I'm not sure if prisms is the right, but
Yeah,
just, you know.
yeah, you could say whatever, cubes or yeah, those, or you could, I would also say, you could say the squares, right? Because depending on if you see the 3D effect as like material or more of like a decoration, so I would count like either square or prisms or the cube, or like it's not a cube, how do you say, like, anyway, volumetric body, I would consider both of them correct. So that's our mark. What are the channels?
Size,
Yes, we have size.
color.
And opacity.
So yes, but we need to be careful here. What does like color? What does color encode?
General type.
Yeah, so
Category.
color here encodes the categorical value. So in a case like this, where you have multiple data kind of like dimensions at the same time, if you analyze marks and channels, you also want to say this dimension, this numerical dimension is encoded by size. The categorical dimension is encoded by color, for example. So you want to be explicit about this association. And I guess you could break this up a little bit further, but this isn't really what we covered. So you could say proximity, like if you talk about perception here, proximity means something, you have grouping. So that's not strictly speaking in the marks and color space, but that would be an interesting observation to make about this chart here.
What would the annotations be considered for in terms of channel, or are the annotations not at all considered when we're looking at the?
Yeah, the annotations, I would just call them annotations, right? This is kind of like supplementary data. Usually, this is not part of the original data set, but something that you see as an interpretation. You could think of it, if, for example, these annotations were to appear dynamically, you could talk about it as like details on demand in an interaction sense, but I wouldn't consider them essentially to be part of data.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Great. So then we go a little bit into a couple of these design principles. So the first one here is the effectiveness principle followed? So did the designer use the best visual channel available for the most important aspect of the data? And are all of the visual channels appropriate, right? Remember, this is like Stephen's psychophysical power law. And then we had this ranking of like position is the strongest. And then we have size. And then we have only like later, we have things like angle and color and saturation, like color value and color saturation and so on. So like the next step would be to think about like, what is the most important aspect in this chart? Does that use the best visual variable available? So basically, does it use position smartly? And if it doesn't, then what does it use instead? Why is that being used? What are like some of the considerations? And are all of these visual channels appropriate? And here you should critique, right? So for example, in the previous chart, you could say, well, I probably have an example here. So here's an example. So here you could say, well, the channels are not used appropriately because as we kind of like established when we did this critique, here, like the radius encodes the data, which is a problem. And so this is clearly not a good chart, right? And here would be like a redesign where we use a more appropriate visual channel for this kind of data. Great. So any questions about this so far? Great. So the next question you should ask yourself is the expressiveness principle followed? Like, does the visualization show all of the data and only the data? And this isn't binary, right? So here, like we talked about this, if there are violations of this principle, are they justified? So is this kind of like useful chart chunk? Is that like, for example, are there completely unnecessary grid lines that just don't make any sense? Or is there something on top that is kind of like aesthetically interesting, appealing, or that are there kind of like, is the value in that part of the visualization? So like if the expressiveness principle is violated, is there like an obvious reason or like a reason that you can see that the designer had to do that? So here, for example, I would argue that the expressiveness principle is violated. So this is clearly like there's a lot of chart chunk here, and it doesn't really make sense, right? So this isn't well justified. But remember that like the monstrous costs or the diamonds are a girl's best friend. These kinds of examples where we had, or even this 3D chart here where we said, hey, this kind of violates some principles by being in 3D. It's kind of harder to perceive. We have kind of like shadows and lighting effects and so on, but maybe it's more engaging. So maybe it kind of like makes sense to do that here. Okay, so then you should also think about perceptual issues, right? So are there any things that like could be a problem for color blindness? So for example, in our like causes of death chart, we had like a green and then a reddish color. So that might potentially be a problem for the 10% of the population that have a red-green weakness. How big is that problem? For example, in this in the 3D chart, it is really like color is redundant. You also have the grouping, so maybe it's not that big of a problem. So you could make these kinds of arguments. Are there any color proximity effects? So remember, color proximity would be, if I go back to this chart again, is that I have something like, does, let's say, this here, where's a good example? Does this here appear lighter than, let's say, this here, because the neighborhood of the stomach cancer, there's a lot of other dark elements. Maybe that kind of like distracts us from actually like, or from actually noticing the shade of the color. So are we sure that these are about the same shade and so on? So these kinds of effects you could consider here and you could discuss here.
For looking at color blindness, seeing how that's affected, seeing that as a big an issue, is that just something that we should make sure we're familiar with the different types of color blindness, or are we allowed to, for example, and there are like some web browser apps you can use in order to check.
Yeah, you can check that, right? You can say, hey, I checked this in these web browser apps, and then notice that for like you can use online resources, right? This is an open book exam. I should have maybe said this in the introduction. You can use online resources. You cannot get explicit help from anybody. Can you please help me critique this visualization? You cannot discuss any part of the exam with anybody in the class, like not at all. Like this is a completely individual exercise. There's no allowable group work. But you can like use online resources. You can read online about stuff and so on. So all of this is absolutely okay.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any Gestalt principles used, for example? Is there kind of like a grouping effect that appears based on the visualization choices? Is pop-out used to kind of like highlight something, or all of these aspects? You can like analyze the perceptual issues of a visualization. So next, you want to look at the scales. Are the scales appropriate? And we talked about this in detail. Are scales like, is there a meaningful zero? If so, you should maybe include the zero. If a scale is clipped, is it justified that it's clipped? Is it clearly communicated? And so on. So are the scales appropriate for what you're looking at? And so here we had these examples of scales that are clearly not appropriate because it really like clipped off the majority and kind of like overemphasized this difference. And so here would be like an example of a zero-based scale and a non-zero-based scale, where I think it is justifiable to use a non-zero-based scale because you want to emphasize this difference. And so if you're like transparent about that, like you are here with the legend, then that's okay. You need to just like make sure that this is kind of like in good faith and also like well designed. The next point related to this is context. Is the data shown in the appropriate context, right? Does it, is there like something left out? Is the data like, does it look like it's cherry picked? We had this example with the climate change, right? Global warming, when you cherry pick your data, it looks like this isn't really a big deal. But if you look at a bigger portion of the data, then it is kind of like problematic. And so here, this isn't necessarily always super easy to see from the visualization, but here you'll have to use some common sense, right? Like is that kind of like, if you see something like tax data or something like voter registration and so on, does it give you the necessary context? That context might also be in like an annotation or in a story that goes along with the visualization. Then, since this is going to be like online, you will have you will get an interactive visualization, and so here you should think about like what kinds of interactions are used. Is it like navigation? Is it focus and context? Is it details on demand? Are these interactions animated? Are there animated transitions? Are the animated transitions helpful? Is the interaction appropriate for the medium? So, for example, like scrollytelling, if it's a scrollytelling aspect, I would say, well, on a desktop computer, it's kind of weird. On an iPad, you could make an argument, and you could have a discussion like that. The one thing that you should think about is direct manipulation used? So is like, do I have to like interact with some sliders that are not really associated with the data, or can I interact directly with the visualization? And then think about what is the purpose of the interaction, right? Do you like, for example, if you have highlighting, the purpose of the interaction would be to kind of like possibly compare between two different views, like two different aspects in the data. If you have navigation, then the purpose of the interaction really is to kind of like browse a larger data set and explore a larger data set than you can see individually, see it at one single time. One question that I would like you to ask is also like, is the data kind of like data munging appropriate? Would derived data be better? So for example, if you think back on this one piece that we looked at about fertility in the US and Japan, where we had like this animation, and then we tried a couple of redesigns, but in the end, we thought that, well, actually, if we just change the data a little bit and use a different encoding, we can maybe have like a much better visualization. So maybe it's better to show change instead of absolute values, or to show the distribution instead of data points. And then anything else that we discussed in any of the design lectures or perception lectures or interaction lectures. So for example, if it's 3D, is it justified? Like, why is it justified? How are the problems of 3D addressed? Does time, if it's a time visualization, is there linear progress in the time? Do we have appropriate legends, labels, and annotations, and this kind of stuff? Okay, so that's kind of like the review of how to critique a visualization. It kind of wraps up my kind of introduction to the exam. I'm happy to take any questions that still might be lingering.
Is this deck posted anywhere for reference?
I'll post it later after this lecture with the slides of the regular lecture.
Thank you.
Yep. There's a question, do you have an average range length of responsive from previous years? No, this isn't usually how we do exams. Usually it was a closed book exams where there was always a critique, but it wasn't as substantial. It was more of like factual knowledge questions, and there were 6 or 7, and this is kind of like our reaction to like being online and being distributed. But you will get a word limit. So we'll kind of like do a reference critique for ourselves, and then we'll give you like 1.5 times the words we needed, and then you have a good sense of how long it should be roughly be. Okay. For the grad portion, it's going to be like a question about something in the papers. So just like read the papers, and then, yeah, it's not going to be like, well, it's going to be answerable from the papers more or less.
Sorry, the questions about 20% for graduate students would be from only those 2 papers?
All of the papers that I explicitly highlighted as mandatory, I do think that were the 2 ones that I did, but I'll double check. Okay, great. So then let's move on.
Alex, there's another question in terms of critiquing paragraphs or bullets.
Generally, bullets are good, right? Because it helps you get to the point, and it's structured is for us as well. So you like a bullet format is good. Like it could be like you could have like let's say you could have maybe like a section that like there will be questions, right? And you can like write in, there will be like a question, for example, like what are the marks and channels? And then you can write in, like you can write directly in that question. You can like add a bulleted list for this data point. These are the marks. These are the channels for this data. For this visualization, these are the marks. These are the channels, and so on. Okay, great. So last time we talked about interactions. I'm going to like quickly look through that. So recall like why, like, well, there's a spectrum of interaction. We have like static content where there's no interaction, and we have dynamic content where things are animated, like kind of in autoplay mode, or completely interactive where users can change something. And we're mostly interested in this interactive space. And the reason why we care about interaction is because we want to explore data that is too big or too complex, where we have too much data, or if we want to kind of like look at different aspects of the data. So there's different ways to show it. So the example here is this like tax rates for companies, and the interaction here is not because the data is too big, there's too much of it, but because we want to look at it in like divided essentially by a different dimension. We want to look at it both overall, but also break out individual sectors of the industry. And so we can use interaction to do that. And interaction also amplifies cognition. If we play with something, we can understand it better, and so on. And then we talked about some interaction methods, like you should think about what you interact with. And then this example of direct manipulation, where you really interact directly with an object. Like here, it would be your brush in 2D in this example, and you can move around that and resize that instead of having some kind of like separate user interface to like query or sliders or anything like that. And so then we talked about the purposes of interaction based on this paper here. And we talked about like changing over time, or just like here that could be either like changing over time literally, or just like stepping into another data set. We talked about animated transitions, why they're useful and what the limits are. So animated transitions are useful if the number of points are kind of like limited, but they can get tricky if we have too much going on and we can't really trace what's going on. Then we talked about interaction for navigation. So we have like pan and zoom as like on a map, or in a 3D object, in a 3D data set, we could also rotate. We talked a little bit about storytelling, its pros and cons. And then we talked about semantic zooming. Remember that semantic zooming is about like, once you zoom into a particular aspect of your data set, you get more information about what you're zooming in. So here, this example is, you see like little spark lines for this processor here, but the one that you zoomed in, you get not only little spark lines, but you get like a full line chart with axis labels and also some and the legend. So kind of like that is revealed dynamically. Then we talked about focus and context, which is about carefully picking what to show and then hint at what you're not showing. There's these kind of like different methods to do focus and context: elision, superimposition, or distortion. Elision really is kind of like bringing in things like tooltips, or like more detailed visualization on demand, or revealing parts of the data on demand. We talked about degree of interest functions, that you could use something like an a priori interest of a data item to like decide how prominent it should be in a display. But you could also use the distance to where you're currently navigating to decide how prominent it is on a display. We talked about some magic lenses, so that you can kind of like have lenses that reveal different aspects of the data, including for things like labels. And then we reviewed distortion methods. So here is an example where we have like a distortion method to kind of zoom in at this particular time frame in the stream graph here. There is, of course, alternatives. You could do something like smart aggregation, and I personally prefer this over like real actual geometric distortion. And then we had these kind of like very like lens-like approaches to zoom in, like fisheyes and hyperbolic geometry, and like a lens for a map here, or like a 1D lens for lists. And so we talked about that this is kind of like potentially problematic, because it has like, it's pretty complex, both to implement, but mostly for the user. It's kind of like makes relative spatial judgments tricky. We have to track the distortion. We have to communicate the distortion. We have the problem of target acquisition and so on. Overview in detail is this kind of like other thing that we like frequently encounter, where we have like an overview. In this like Warcraft example, it would be the map down here, and then we have the detail of what is going on in the scene at the moment. Here we would have like an overview and detail component, like this is a scatter plot with movies in the back end, and the detail here is when I click one of those marks, I get details about this particular movie. And then essentially the last thing we talked about was filtering and dynamic querying, We reviewed Schneiderman's mantra that says essentially like overview first, zoom and filter, then details on demand. This is kind of like a general like visualization approach. And then there's also relate, history, and extract, but I'll not talk about them too much today. And then this is where we kind of stopped. We had this design critique about dynamic queries, about this kind of like home finder. And so this was the exercise. And now I wanted to kind of ask anybody like want to share what their redesign ended up looking like.
I like the map, but I said that it would be nice to be able to have different things to give you like a different color for based on like, let's say crime rate in the neighborhood, or you could even put points for where like hot spots of crime are, or something like highlight by which school district it is. Or another thing would be to have like a minimum threshold. So if you put in something and it only returns 3 searches within the area that's there, it'll zoom out to give you 10 searches or 10 hits.
Yeah, these are all great ideas. Anybody did a design that explicitly shows the distribution of homes for like the bedrooms? Are there like more 7-bedroom places or than 1-bedroom places in the DC area? Anybody have an idea for like a direct manipulation interface?
I think we can do it by the size of points. For example, for 7-bedroom apartments, we can use a larger point and something like that, or maybe using a color and have a list of colors for the number of bedrooms.
Yeah, so we could kind of like enhance our map to show some additional attributes. Okay, I'm gonna like show you what I did like as a simple redesign here. So first, the piece that this visualization, let me draw here. So what this visualization didn't do, like if you remember the video, it didn't explicitly show the border, right? Like where like the radius from your house, it really only let you kind of like, the points disappeared from the screen, but it didn't explicitly show the border. And so in my redesign, I would explicitly encode the distance from the point that you've set with a circle. And then I would be able to kind of like drag that circle in and out so that I have then like direct manipulation of my filter. So now I can, instead of like having to like use a slider somewhere on the right here to set that variable, I can just like drag that around, and I can like show like a tooltip here, like what is the distance to be, and what is the what is the distance to be, and then I can kind of like adjust that more dynamically, more flexibly. So that would be like one redesign that I did. The second redesign that I did is I made these sliders smarter. So I kind of like, here would be my slider, but then I did also add a histogram on top of these sliders, so that I would see within the first like this closed portion here, maybe like 0 to 3 miles, there's not a lot of houses, but if I go outwards, there's more houses that are available. And similarly for like if I had the number of bedrooms, right, I could show here like there's like only a few 1-bedroom places, there's a lot of 2-bedroom places, then there's like more 3-bedroom places, and then we have very few 4, and then 5 and 6 and 7 or something like that. And so now I have a better idea of like if I apply a filter, what would happen, right? Like how many houses are still left. And then I went a little crazy and did kind of like 2 alternative scenarios, right? Like what if either I could try to find a home that is close for my spouse and for me, or I could say, hey, we really only want to have 1 car, so that means one of us needs to be like in biking or walking direction to distance to work. And so here you have kind of like 2 conditions, like B1 and B2, and what are the different options for that. And the rest of this here gets a little bit more complicated, but this is like, yeah, this gets into like more complicated analytical questions, which you could also just explore at different time points. Okay, so any questions about this exercise? Great, so then let's move on. So visual queries are like super powerful, and they don't have to be in this like concrete space of a map. They can be also in like abstract visualization. So here, this is this parallel coordinates technique. We'll talk about tabular data visualization techniques on Tuesday. And here I have like this visual query by drawing this brush. And this is kind of like a very powerful way of saying, hey, I want to like query like for all of the cars that have like more than 20 miles per gallon. And I can do this in combinations, right? I can I want all of the cars that have at least an economy of 20 miles per gallon, but also have at least 80 horsepower. So I can do these combined queries like that. And these visual queries, I can like, they work in many kind of contexts, right? I can do like a line chart with like a rectangle select. I can do things like, let me bring this up. I can do like here's a couple of different ways. Like here I have a tool that would be, I could do like a rectangle select. I could move that rectangle around. Or I could do kind of like a paintbrush, which is kind of like super nice and efficient to do that. Or I could do a lasso, which isn't implemented in this particular example here. But all of these are options that you can use to allow people to run these visual queries. And you can also do that in volume. So for example, you could say, here is an example where like you start off by drawing like a bounding box that kind of like goes through the like brainstem, and then you kind of like highlight some other branches, some other regions with 3D navigation. Of course, the interaction here is a little bit trickier, but you can definitely do that. Another thing that you can do is this, like for querying, you can do incremental text search, which is actually very powerful if you have a lot of data. So remember, this is the baby name wizard where I can just type in like 2 characters, and then it subsets it dynamically to all of the names that start with those 2 characters. And so something like that is very frequently like a great way to deal with long lists, and to kind of like dynamically visualize the results. Or you could have more explicit query interfaces. So here, this is like a set visualization interface that I'll be talking about more in our set example. But the point here is really like, I'm looking at movies, action, adventure, children, comedy, crime, documentary, drama, thriller, romance. And then I can choose like, what are the movies that I want to do? I want like to be all the action movies included in my set. I don't care about adventure movies, but I don't want children's movies, right? So you could build like an explicit visual query like this. And this interface also gives you like a natural language equivalent of the query. So intersection of sets action and comedy, but excluding set children. And so there will be more on filters in a future lecture, which actually will be starting right now. Okay, so the first part about interaction here was really all about, mostly about interacting with a single view. But now I want to talk about multiple views, but not only about interacting with multiple views, but generally about the properties of multiple views. So this all goes back to this kind of like phrase that I've been using a lot, is this like eyes over memory idea. So if you have multiple aspects of your data, you have either the choice to show it first aspect 1 and then for aspect 2, or you can show both at the same time. And if you want to show both at the same time, you can try to like add additional encodings into one visualization, or you can actually just show two visualizations of kind of the same items next to each other. So this kind of like results in this trade-off between display space and working memory. And so here, like on the right, this is a graphic from our textbook that shows what are kind of roughly the options that you have when you have multiple views. And so the big ones here are in the middle, like the data versus encoding. If you have multiple views, do the multiple views show the same data? Or do they show a subset of the same data? Or do they show different data? So for example, if I were to show kind of like patient information in a hospital record, I could have like one person's like historical cholesterol values in one view, and I could have like a detailed view of this person's like cholesterol values for the last 2 years. That would be, I'm showing the subset of the data, maybe with the same encoding. But I could say, hey, I want to see the cholesterol data and I want to see some other hormone values next to each other, because then I need to make judgments about those together. Then I would actually show different data and would use small multiples. I still have the same patient or the same group of patients, but different data about them. So that's kind of like the data dimension. And the encoding dimension here is the encoding the same or is it different? So that's fairly easy. For if you have you can simply, like, if you have the same data, you don't really want to use the same encoding, because then you have just the same view twice. But sometimes it makes sense to show the same data with two different views, because we know that each of the, like if you use two different visualizations, they support different tasks. They can reveal different kinds of things in a data set. If you have a subset, it is usually about overview and detail. So you give like context and then browse, zoom into something in detail. And if you don't have the same data, then you don't really have linkage, so you can't really do that in that case. Okay, so let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So first, what are linked views? Linked views are multiple views that are simultaneously visible and are linked together such that actions in one view affect the others. The typical example is highlighting, but it could also be navigation. So highlighting, the question here is to link or not. Navigation is to share navigation or not. And then we have these kind of like encoding and data set dimensions that I discussed just earlier. And so linked highlighting is kind of like the bread and butter. Linked navigation is again more about this detail on demand. And so I'll give you examples. This here is like a MATLAB example of linked highlighting. Okay, this video isn't playing. Okay, something broke with that video. Anyways, it's fairly simple. I would just, like, if you highlight points here, the corresponding items in the other views are highlighted, just as like I showed in the earlier example. Here's a little bit more sophisticated example of linked highlighting. So this is a tool that's called Kashif, and you have, like, here you have a lot of different views. This is about security of aid workers, and so we have like a map view. We have like where some, like, this is about incidents that happened. Did they happen on a road? Was it unknown? Was it at a project site? Was it in a public location? How was this attack carried out? Was it a kidnapping, a shooting, some bombardment, kidnapping? What was the context? What was the global region, and so on? And so these are all different dimensions in different data sets. And so now I could say, like, use here linked highlighting to select Afghanistan, and then, well, in this case, it was actually even a filter. So if I just click on any of those aspects, we would immediately drill down into that particular countries, and then I can clear those filters and explore that in more detail. So one important concept if we have multiple views is this idea of multiform. If I have these different visual encodings between views, this kind of implies shared data, and the shared data is either all of the data or a subset of the data. So we have overview plus detail. And the rationale here is that like a single view can't show everything. There's limits on the attributes, and then different views support different tasks. This is like a homework from a couple of years ago, where we have two visualizations that essentially show the same data. This was kind of like at in the 2012 election, and so you have kind of like the representation of the states first on top and also on bottom, and how likely they are to go for a particular candidate is color coded, and so both of them show the same data. The other, like the big map here, brings in a little bit more context because it brings in the geospatial context. So we have two different visualizations that show roughly the same data, but like a little bit more context for one of them. Here's like an example from the literature. Like one of the two major types of network visualizations are adjacency matrices and node link diagrams, and they have different pros and cons. And this tool allows you to just put them side by side and look at your network simultaneously, so that you can spot patterns in one and then explore what it looks like in the other, kind of like to understand your network better. Here's another example for like multiform visualization in a network tool. This here is all about path, like finding path between nodes. And there's two views here. One is like a list of paths, and the other one here is like an overview of all of the possible paths that are shown here. And so they essentially show the same background data, but they have different properties. Because I'm using this ranked list here, I can use like additional attributes, like I can encode additional attributes that would be tricky to show in here. But then I don't really get the overall network structure from this one here on the side, but I do get the overall network structure from this one here on the right. The other thing that you use multiple views for is overview and detail. Here, like one view often shows the summarized information about an entire data set, while additional views show more detail about a subset of the data. And this is especially useful for large and complex data, where you also need to look at fine details. And so in this example here, we are looking at a time series at multiple levels of detail. And I would say it's not the best kind of like visual encoding, but like here, the top view here is our like overview. So this is the whole time series for the time range we have it. And then we have like a blue brush here. And that blue brush here corresponds to this rectangle here. So we have now like a detail of whatever is going on in this blue brush here in that piece here. And then we have a yellow brush here, and that yellow brush corresponds to everything that is in this rectangle. And then we have like a red and the green brush, and drill in more and more and more. So this is kind of like the idea of this stacked zooming approach. We frequently want to use this to like also using different views. So this here is an example that Ryan Meyer, who is also at the University of Utah, developed, which is about kind of like conservation, genetic conservation between different species. And there are three different views, but I'll just play this video quickly.
MISBE is a multi-scale synteny browser for comparative genomics data. It is the first synteny browser with side-by-side linked views of the data across a range of scales. The genome view showing all of its chromosomes, the chromosome view showing all of its blocks, and the block view showing all of the conserved genomic features within it. MISBE incorporates a variety of visual cues and interaction mechanisms that allow biologists to understand 4 different relationship types: proximity, size, orientation, and similarity. The high-level genome view shows a circular overview of all source chromosomes on the outer ring, with the destination chromosomes on the inner ring. Selecting a source chromosome highlights it in black, and a copy of it also appears inside. We encode the syntenic relationship using connection, with B-spline curves linking the matched blocks colored by the destination chromosome using a repeating 8-element color map. The colors also provide an overview of all block destinations in the outer source genome ring. We can flip through the source chromosomes with left and right arrow keys or using mouse clicks. Our version of edge bundling is based on block contiguity.
Okay, so the main point I wanted to make about this is that we have like this overview piece here. You can navigate in an overview piece, and then you get details that also like have shared filtering and so on in these two additional views here. Here's another example of overview plus detail. This is from work I did a while ago. Here we are looking at clusters of gene expression data and how that applies to pathways. But the idea here is really like I have these small clusters here, and if I wanted to look at one of those clusters in more detail, I could click it, and I would get this detail view, which essentially shows the same visualization, but with a lot more space. And so I can look at this one particular piece in more detail. And similarly here on the right, I have the small overview elements, and then I have like a big detail view here in the middle that I can dynamically pop up for any of these subsets. So we talked a little bit about small multiples already, but only implicitly. So now I want to make it explicit. So small multiples is kind of like a technique where each view uses the same visual encoding, but shows a different subset of the data. And this is really about quickly comparing different parts of the data, relying on eyes instead of memory. And so like one typical example is if I have like a network with also attributes on top of it, it is kind of tricky to like show multiple attributes on those little nodes, right? And so what I can do, I could do animation, right? I could play like a video, but we already know that this is tricky. I could instead just like break it up into groups, like here, based on like each attribute gets this, it shows the same graph, but just the attribute on top of it is different. And now I can start making comparisons between those two little networks, and I can maybe see that here, this one group, I have much more, like a lot more red nodes than I do have in this example here, or at least there's different red nodes. And then here, the red nodes are quite different from this one. And if I wanted to look at any one in detail, again, I have this ability to show these details on demand in this larger view. I also like this, the small multiple approach is also in this visualization that I just showed just earlier. Like you have networks that are color-coded on top of it in multiples, and then you can reveal individual networks on demand. Okay, so one super important thing about visualization is kind of like partitioning your data in the right way, and partitioning and then showing the partitions in separate views. So partitioning is the action, as an action on a data set that separates the data into groups, and you have a lot of design choices here when you partition data. Like how do you divide the data up between views? For example, if you have a hierarchy of attributes, how many splits do you make? What is the order of splits? How many views do you want to create? And your partition attributes are typically categorical, but they can also be bins. So I could say everything above a certain threshold is one bin, everything below a certain threshold is another bin. So here is the same data shown in two different partitionings. This is age distribution by state. And so first we are, like on the left here, we are partitioning it by state. And then we're showing kind of like, this is kind of a group bar chart where we show the age distribution by the states. So kind of like that chart is fairly easy to read, but we could also partition by age group and state. So now we have kind of split the data twice. We have partitioned by state in the columns and by age groups in the rows. And so kind of like they allow different tasks, right? Because I can now look more easily across age groups because these are like now adjacent to each other. But I kind of don't get quite as nice of an view of the individual state, like what's going on in the state. So those two have different purposes, and usually when you have the power to partition, like a particular partition will be well suited to answer one question, but maybe not so well to answer another question. You can, like, a simple way to partition would be to partition data by category. Here we have like the famous ARIS data set partitioned by the species in this two-dimensional plots here. Of course, there is not a lot of overlap here, so that wouldn't be all that difficult to see in a single plot. And like one idea that kind of takes this partitioning like and formalizes this are these trellis plots. These partitions are like called like panel variables, where you have the attributes that are encoded in individual views, and then you have these partitioning variables that are assigned to the columns and rows. And then you can make this a little bit more fancy to do things like main effects ordering, so that you sort your partitions smartly based on derived data, or to support the perception of trends and structure in the data. So sounds a little abstract. Let me give you like this concrete example here. What we're looking at here is like the data is barley yields in 2 years across multiple farms for multiple barley strains. So we have like the farms are in the rows here. We have Waseca, University Farm, Morris. Then we have the years. They are partitioning the columns here. And then we have the strains that are further partitioning like this into these rows here. So like these different strains, and notice that the order of these partitions is consistent. And now we show the yield for these different strains in these different farms for these 2 different years. And we can see that it looks like Waseca Farm in 1931 was kind of like among the more productive farms. Morris Farm was not productive, but we had this one outlier here. We can make a comparison between years, but it's kind of not so easy, right? Because they're not like I have to do like a length comparison here, or like a position comparison, but there's not an aligned scale. So that's a little bit more tricky. And what I could do instead is I could choose to superimpose instead of juxtapose if I want to focus on the year. So here, like the right chart is the same as before. The left chart now shows the 2 years in the same chart. And now by color coding it, I can like make these like easy comparisons between those 2 different years. Of course, the downside is that this kind of like works for 2 years, maybe for 3 years, maybe for 4, but probably not so well for 4. So starting at like a larger number, this gets really tricky to do. And so you always have to be mindful, is like juxtaposition or superimposition the right choice if you want to visualize these different data sets. You can also do like recursive subdivision. Like we kind of did that, but before already. But to bring that point home, you can also like flexibly transform data attributes into a hierarchy. And then, for example, you could use a tree map as a space filling rectangular layout. So if you have what is like more or less a tabular data set, like market information on the stock market, you could kind of introduce a hierarchy, right? You could say my top level hierarchy are the industry sector. My second level hierarchy is are these companies profitable or not, and so on. And so you could dynamically create the hierarchy. And this is exactly what this particular tool here does. So this here is a housing data set of London property. You have like the top level categorization here are the housing type. Is it a flat? Is it semi-detached, or is it a terrace house? Then there is then on the next level, it is partitioned by the neighborhood. And then on the next level, it is partitioned by sale time. And then there's like encoding attributes, the average price and color, the number of sales and size. And so we can then do between neighborhoods comparisons. We see different housing distribution. And within neighborhoods, we see that there's similar prices. But there is like a video that I want to show that explains this nicely. It looks like my videos are not working today. Okay, there's a Vimeo link.
This video accompanies the InfoVis 2009 paper of the same name. It demonstrates how hierarchical layouts can be used to explore multivariate data through the reconfiguration, using London property transactions as an example. We run through all the figures in the paper using the notation we developed to describe their states, the operators we use to reconfigure their states, and show how this can help us address research questions. Property transactions in this view are conditioned using property type and the year of sale. Rectangles are sized by the number of sales and coloured by the average price. Almost half of all sales are flats. Since rectangles are ordered by size, temporal trends are difficult to detect. We will now reconfigure the layouts to arrange the years chronologically. This view more clearly shows the upward trend in average price. To increase the temporal granularity, we will add month to the hierarchy. We also recolour to reflect the number of sales. We call these calendar views. Years are arranged from left to right and months from top to bottom for each year. Purple is used to show the number of sales, which appear to vary seasonally. We expect there to be spatial variation in these data, so we will now insert London Borough into the base of the hierarchy and use orange to show average price again. There are marked differences in sales, shown through size, and price, shown through colour, between boroughs, but it's difficult to see how this varies spatially, as all the rectangles are ordered by size from the top left. We can see, however, that Wandsworth in the top left has the most sales, and the City of London has the least. The size order doesn't let us identify spatial patterns very easily, so we now rearrange the rectangles spatially and temporally. We can now detect some spatial patterns. For example, we can see that the highest average prices tend to be central and west of the centre, and that sales of flats dominate centrally, but less so peripherally. Rectangles are small where there are low sales, making it difficult to see the detail. In the next view, we fix the size of rectangles to show each with equal prominence. The detail of property types can now be resolved more easily, even where sales are low. To study how much each borough differs from the average ratio of property type sales, we will hypothesize that all boroughs will have the average ratio of sales, establish this as a baseline, and then colour by the deviation of sales from this using a signed chi-statistic. This procedure can be used to test hypotheses. The diverging colour scheme shows blue for lower than the baseline and red for higher than the baseline, showing that flat sales dominate in the centre, but terraced and detached housing dominate in more peripheral areas. We will now remove property type from the hierarchy. These calendar views by borough show sales and average price by month within each year. As such, monthly trends by year are emphasized.
Okay, I think you get the idea. I just find it fascinating, like basically just like slicing this data set in different ways. It can answer so many different questions, and it kind of like creates this intuitive representations of it. Of course, like the question is, how do you allow the interactive manipulation of this? In this particular paper, you actually wrote the code, and it was a very impressive talk because they wrote the code live for all of the different visualizations when they gave this presentation. But I think this could be an interesting research area, like how do you create these slices dynamically and with an easy approach. Okay, so we talked a little bit about layering already, but as a comparison to multiple views, but I want to kind of emphasize that layering is an important way also to deal with multiple views. So that is really combining multiple views on top of one another to form a composite view. This kind of like supports a larger, more detailed view than using multiple views. It also moves everything into the same space, the same dimensions. I can make these comparisons easily. But then there's like constraints on the visual encodings choice that I have and the number of layers that can be shown. So layering is super common in line charts, right? Like you can think of a line chart with multiple lines as actually like 3 layered line charts on top of each other. And so that is like useful, easy to do. And it is also kind of like a great way to do things if you are on the same dimension, like if you have the same scale axis. If you don't have the same axis, it's usually a problem. But that can also get cluttered. So here, like, is an example of like a few lines work. A lot of lines kind of tend to get very messy and tend to kind of like overemphasize outliers maybe. But layering doesn't have to happen with exactly the same visualization. So here it's kind of like layering two things like shipping cost and profit with 2 different visual representations. So that is kind of like, you can do that, but you have to be very mindful about it, right? Because like I'm personally not a big fan of charts that have more than one axis. And so like it's possible, sometimes it might be useful, because here you kind of see that shipping cost and profit seem to be very correlated, but you might also be able to just see that just as well with a separate chart. And so don't really do this dual axis. If you play with dual axis and scaling, you can kind of emphasize very, very spurious correlations, right? So the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. This is kind of like from this website that finds these kinds of weird correlations that don't have to have anything in common. And then you can, of course, combine all of this. Here you have like a partitioned and a layered graph, and it's also synchronized through highlighting. And again, my video here doesn't work, but the point here is like these on the top here, you have like these individual graphs in small multiples. They're partitioned by this hierarchy here, but then there's these layers for these two different dimensions in addition to it that kind of give you like a better summary impression in the columns and also separately in the rows. So you kind of like have, in this case, you have both multiple views and layered views. And then finally, this here is like a project we did a while. You can actually combine views in like very, let's say, creative ways and show relationships between them, and you can take it to the max. And this is kind of like the idea of this tool. I'll just show like a brief demo here.
For extracting, comparing, and manipulating subsets across multiple tabular datasets. This video demonstrates Domino using a music charts dataset. You can download a demo version and the dataset at domino.kaleido.org. This is the main Domino interface. It consists of a Domino board and the block browser. The block browser shows a list of all loaded data subsets. Domino distinguishes between three block types. Partition blocks show categorical data like gender. Numerical blocks show numerical data such as the release year of the first album. And matrix blocks show item combinations like the count of #1 hits for each artist in different countries. Relationships are represented in different granularities and directions using lines and bands. Placeholders and live previews help to add new blocks. When dragging an element from the block browser onto the board, possible drop positions are indicated. When entering a placeholder, a live preview of the data is shown. By dropping the item, the selection is confirmed. Domino allows users to quickly create advanced setups. Blocks can be added. Visualization types can be switched. Blocks can be transposed.
So yeah, so you see that I can kind of like, based on like a multi-dimensional data set, I can create very complex visualizations and show relationships between them using these kind of links between the individual visualizations. Okay, so that's it for today. That wraps up the lecture. And next Tuesday, I'll be talking about tabular data visualization. And then like Thursday, we'll be having our exam. I'll stick around for a while for a couple of questions if there are any, but I'll turn off the recording now. Thanks, everyone.